Story 1. The Secret Resident. I was a 21-year-old college student moving into my first off-campus house with two close friends. It was a beautiful old place with a charm that we couldn't resist, complete with its hardwood floors and old-fashioned windows. But the house had one eerie feature, a dark, unfinished basement. The landlord had given us strict instructions never to go down there, claiming it was unsafe. We thought nothing of it and focused on enjoying our new space. However, it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. Almost every night around midnight, we'd hear faint noises from the basement. It sounded like the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone pacing back and forth. At first, we dismissed it as the sounds of an old house settling, but the sounds grew louder over time, and sometimes we'd even hear whispering. Whenever we worked up the courage to open the basement door, silence greeted us, and the darkness beyond was too thick and consuming to see anything clearly. One night, as we were unwinding in the living room, our roommate Jess froze mid-laugh and stared at the basement door. Her face went pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered. We turned, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a hand withdrawing behind the door. Terrified, we quickly agreed it was probably our imagination. But deep down, each of us felt an unsettling presence lurking in the shadows. The next day, while we were away, Jess heard scratching and whispers coming from the basement. Scared, she grabbed her phone and started recording. When we listened to it that evening, our hearts sank. There on the recording was a clear voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering, "You can't hide from me." Panic set in. We called the landlord and demanded answers, convinced something was horribly wrong. After a long silence, he confessed the house had a hidden history. A former tenant had gone missing years ago, never to be found. The landlord suspected someone had been using the basement as a hideaway without permission. He dismissed our concerns, but we were terrified. That night, after trying to sleep through the anxiety, I woke up to the sound of faint breathing right outside my bedroom door. I froze, listening, too terrified to move. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and there, silhouetted in the faint light from the hallway, was a figure, a tall, shadowy man. His head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and his eyes seemed to glisten with something unhinged. Paralyzed, I stared at him, but then he whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You were never supposed to see me." Just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving me breathless and terrified. The next morning, we packed our bags and left that house for good, abandoning our lease and all our belongings. I never returned to retrieve my things, and I never found out who or what that man was. But to this day, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper, that voice that still echoes in my nightmares. "You can't hide from me." Let me know if you'd like to hear the second story in this chilling series. Here's the second story in this terrifying basement horror series. Story 2, The Hidden Door. When I was 12, my family moved into a new home on the outskirts of town. It was an old, two-story house with a basement that I was immediately drawn to. I loved exploring, and the basement had the air of mystery about it, with a smell of stale wood and an ominous stillness that felt different from the rest of the house. The basement was unfinished, filled with boxes left by the previous owners, and odd relics from a different era, rusted tools, broken picture frames, and old wooden shelves. But something that immediately stood out to me was a small, faded door on the far wall, barely noticeable in the dim light. One day, as I was rummaging through the basement, I felt a draft coming from that door. I got closer and realized it had a small lock, though it was old and rusty. My curiosity got the best of me, so I found a small screwdriver and managed to force it open. Behind the door was a narrow tunnel, barely tall enough to stand upright in, leading into total darkness. The air was thick with a damp, metallic scent that made me hesitate, but my curiosity won, and I slowly stepped inside. As I moved forward, my flashlight caught sight of scratch marks on the walls, deep and desperate, running the length of the narrow passageway. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me to press on. Halfway through, I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't loud or labored, just a soft, eerie inhale and exhale, as if someone was standing right behind me. I whipped around, shining my light in every direction, but there was nothing. I backed out slowly, heart pounding, and shut the door tight, telling myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed, wide awake, when I heard soft thumping sounds coming from the basement. The slow, rhythmic beats grew louder and louder until it sounded like someone was pounding on the walls. My heart raced as I realized the sound was coming from inside that hidden room. The next day, I told my mom, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just the house settling. That evening, I decided to put an end to it and went down to the basement, determined to face whatever was behind that door. But when I got there, I noticed something terrifying: deep scratch marks on the outside of the door, as if someone or something had been trying to get out. In a panic, I threw myself against the door, pressing it shut with all my might, but a cold, breathy whisper reached my ear, one word that I'll never forget: please. It was a soft, desperate plea, as though someone trapped in that darkness was begging for freedom. I bolted upstairs, locking the basement door behind me and telling my parents everything. My father went down to check, but he found nothing unusual. No scratch marks, no signs of any hidden room. I was told I had an overactive imagination and was forbidden from going to the basement alone. But I knew the truth, and I was haunted by it. Years later, after we'd moved away, I read an article about our old home. It had been built on the grounds of an old asylum, and one of the patients had gone missing before it shut down. They never found his body. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whisper in my mind. I still see that hand reaching for freedom in the darkness, clawing for a way out. And I wonder if someone or something is still down there, waiting for someone brave enough to open that door once again. Would you like to hear the third and final story? Here's the third and final story in this terrifying basement horror series. Story 3, The Man in the Mirror. It was a chilly autumn evening when my parents left me in charge of our new house while they ran some errands. I'd only just turned 17, so they trusted me to hold down the fort for a few hours. The house was quaint but old, with creaky floors and drafty windows that gave it a haunted feel, especially after dark. It had a basement, one that I'd barely visited since we moved in, because, to be honest, it creeped me out. That evening, as I was watching TV, I heard what sounded like a faint tapping coming from below. It was slow and steady, almost like a heartbeat. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just pipes rattling in the old house. But the tapping continued, and soon it began to morph into a low, scraping sound that raised every hair on my body. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I opened the basement door and crept down the stairs, each step echoing in the eerie silence. The basement was a typical storage area, with dusty boxes and an old furnace. But as I swept my flashlight across the room, something glinted in the far corner: a mirror. It was an antique, tall and wide, with an ornate cracked frame, leaning against the wall. I hadn't noticed it before, and it seemed oddly out of place, almost like it didn't belong. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Slowly I approached the mirror, curiosity and fear battling within me. As I got closer, I noticed something strange in my reflection. My face looked a little off, as though it were tinted in shades of gray, and my eyes appeared darker, hollowed out. I took a step back, breathing hard, but something else caught my eye. A figure standing directly behind me. A tall, gaunt man with pale skin and a chilling, hollow stare. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror, and there he was again, looming over my shoulder. This time, his mouth twisted into a smile so unnaturally wide it looked like his skin would tear. I stumbled back, but he raised a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. I tore my eyes away from the mirror and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it, my heart pounding in terror. I could still feel his gaze on me, like he was staring straight through the floor. Desperate for answers, I called my parents and asked about the mirror, but they had no idea what I was talking about. They said there was no mirror in the basement. When they returned, I was a wreck, but I led them downstairs anyway. And when we got to the basement, it was gone. No mirror, no sign of anything unusual. My parents looked at me like I was losing my mind, but I knew what I had seen. The horror didn't end there. That night, as I lay in bed, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping coming from my bedroom wall. My heart raced as I forced myself to turn and look. There, reflected in the mirror across the room, was that same gaunt figure, his dark eyes locked onto mine, that twisted grin stretching across his face. I screamed, but the sound barely left my mouth before he raised his finger to his lips again. Slowly, he mouthed the words, "You can't hide." I never slept in that room again. I spent the next year sleeping on the couch, unable to face the mirror, afraid of what I might see. Eventually, we moved away, but I still feel his presence sometimes, like he's watching me through every reflective surface I pass. To this day, I can't bear to look into a mirror at night, terrified that one day he'll be waiting there, on the other side, grinning that same horrifying grin. Let me know if you enjoyed these stories, or if there's anything else spooky you'd like to hear about.